Hello everybody, welcome to the Period Closet Downton Abbey podcast. Now this podcast is where one woman will rewatch the iconic period drama series Downton Abbey with a cup of tea and some rich tea biscuits. Now please make sure to go follow us on Instagram at the Period Closet for more of our exciting content about all your favourite period dramas. Now the main purpose of this podcast, guys, is for you to simply enjoy it and have fun. We will be talking about each Downton Abbey episode, going behind the scenes into the making of the show, and the characters. We'll be looking at all aspects of the production to gain an overall understanding of why so many of you love this show and the story of the Crawley family. Now, if you like my podcast series and you want more, in the future we'll make some more for other period dramas and films with a certain Duke of Hastings, The Crown, Poldark. Comment what podcast you would like me to do next. You are watching the Period Closet Downton Abbey podcast. Coming up, we meet the Crawley family, discuss the sinking of the Titanic, and wonder who Matthew Crawley is. Please make sure to follow on our Instagram at the Period Closet for more of our exciting content about all your favourite period dramas. The pilot episode establishes that this TV series is set in the fictional Yorkshire village of Downton, which is in the north of England. Our first shot is of a steam train, which was one of the main modes of transport in this era. It's kind of funny how that every opening scene in Downton Abbey, whether that's the film or the pilot episode, that a train is their preferred mode of transport to entice the audience in, wanting to know more about the show. The camera then pans to Mr. Bates, played by Brendan Cole, looking out a window, admiring the English countryside, probably travelling to the Yorkshire village of Ripon, as most of the Downton characters go to Ripon Station to travel into London or visit their relatives elsewhere in the country. Series 1 starts in April 1912, the day after the sinking of the Titanic, and during this month there was a national coal strike which didn't allow around 600 train journeys and services nationwide. So I'm going to slightly question what train Mr. Bates is currently on to get to Downton Abbey, because there was a train strike. We are presented with scenes of the village of Downton, which was actually filmed in Bampton, Oxfordshire. Now, I've visited Bampton myself, as I have some family members who live nearby, and it's one of those villages that is so English and international audiences would always associate with the UK. Then, in all its majestic majesty, Highclere Castle, which is located in Newbury, Berkshire, the home of Downton Abbey. Highclere Castle was chosen as a location for Downton, as Julian Fellowes, the creator of Downton Abbey, wanted an estate that had a straightforward layout in terms of the rooms and floor plan, so that the audience can simply know what rooms are for the Crawley family and their household staff. Highclere Castle was built in 1838 during the Victorian era by Sir Charles Barry, who constructed the Houses of Parliament. A lot of the architecture from the Houses of Parliament was mirrored in the design of Highclere Castle. The house is now occupied by Lady Carnarvon, the 9th Countess of Grantham, and I definitely recommend checking out their social media content because it's always great to get a glimpse behind the scenes what's happening at Highclere Castle. Inside Downton, it's 6 a.m. and Daisy the scullery maid, played by Sophie Rhea-Jones, is waking all the servants up for the working day ahead. All the interior scenes for rooms like Lady Mary's bedroom, Lord Grantham's bedroom, the servants' living quarters, the kitchens, the scullery were not filmed at Highclere, but were constructed at Ealing Studios in London. When the production team were filming a series, they would usually film the servant scenes first, before filming at Highclere. Now, a little behind the scenes trick that the set department did, in order for the viewers to know the living quarters of the Crawleys and the servants, they copied the designs of door frames, door handles and windows from Highclere and placed them in the Ealing Studio set, so it looks like one continuous scene. What I like about the opening scene in this episode is that we can sense that the narrative of Downton Abbey is focused on two social classes of people, which are the Crawley family and their household staff, which is something we really didn't see in a period drama for this time. And there's one slight historical inaccuracy in the opening montage when Daisy is sorting out the fireplace in the drawing room with her bare hands, as scullery maid in Edwardian times would be mending fireplaces wearing gloves. Coming down the grand staircase later on with his Labrador is the owner and main man of the Downton Abbey Manor, who is Robert Crawley, or Lord Grantham to his staff, played by Hugh Bonneville. Hugh described the character of Robert in an interview as having a personality of a serious bank manager. Robert goes to greet head butler Carson, played by Jim Carter, with his dog Pharaoh. Now, you'll probably notice all the dogs in the Crawley family have names associated with Egyptian gods and goddesses like Isis, Pharaoh and Tia. These names are probably intentional as it links to the history of Highclere Castle, as the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who lived at Highclere, was George Herbert. He was responsible for funding Howard Carter's archaeological dig in Egypt that led to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in November 1922. Meanwhile, upstairs, staring out of a window, looking tired and glum, is Lady Mary Crawley, played by Michelle Dockery, the eldest of the Crawley daughters. Mary is the elder sister to feminist Sybil, played by Jessica Brown Finlay, and Edith, played by Laura. Throughout Downton Abbey, Mary is one of my favourite characters as she develops and a lot of stuff happens to her, especially around potential suitors and motorcar accidents. So that's why she's one of my favourite characters in the show. Now, news quickly spreads through Downton about the sinking of the Titanic. Now, unlike the James Cameron film starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet and Billy Zane, where Jack, Rose and Cal were impacted by the Titanic, Downton's version of the Titanic sinking seems to be a talking point for all the characters, whether that is Cora reading about it in the Daily Sketch, Daisy thinking about the disaster, or Robert hearing about the fate of some of his friends and family who were on board. I like how all the characters in the show discuss the Titanic, which connotes that everyone was affected by this event in the 20th century, no matter what social class you were a part of. Likewise, the Titanic was a turning point in the 20th century in regards to equality, society and social ranking, which are things that were slowly starting to not be as highly regarded in the world, and this led to other events in a couple of years' time, such as the suffragette movement and World War I. The Titanic does impact everyone, but no more than Lady Mary, who was engaged to Patrick, the heir to Downton Abbey. So it wasn't just Jack and Rose that went down in the sinking of the ship. Ultimately, this means that the new heir to the Downton estate is Matthew Crawley, Robert's 4th cousin, who works as a lawyer specialising in country property, which means Mary isn't the true heir to the Downton estate, as the Crawley family have only managed to produce daughters. If this all happened in this day and age, this wouldn't be a problem. However, 100 years ago, women weren't allowed to inherit estates or titles because of the entail. In the show, that means that cousin Matthew and not one of the daughters would get to inherit everything. While this seems harsh and groundless, it was very much a reality for women in the past. The show accurately depicts the issue of the entail and that it truly affected many people, stripping them of their rightful inheritance by birth simply due to their gender. In the midst of everyone learning about the Titanic, we learn about Cora Crawley, Lady Grantham, played by Elizabeth McGovern. Cora is shown to be an American, which might surprise some people watching the pilot episode, but American aristocrats marrying in British nobility was a common convention of the period, as between the late 19th century and the Second World War, countless floods of dollar princesses who were females of American nobility like Cora fled to England to marry British men within high society. Women like Cora were dubbed as being the new money or bloodline for the upper English class, as the aristocracy had gone downhill at this point, so they needed to bring in some new blood for future generations. This craze even had an impact on the future British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, as his mother, Jenny, was an American socialite who married Lord Randolph Churchill in 1884. Downstairs, we get introduced to more and more of the household, like Anna, Bates, Barrow, O'Brien, Gwen, and Mrs. Patmore, all played by Joanne Froggatt, Brendan Cole, Robert James Collier, Rose Leslie, and Leslie Nicole. One interesting point to note here is that Rose Leslie, who plays Gwen, in her actual family tree, she can be linked back to royalty such as Charles II. When creating the character of Mr. Bates, Julian Fellowes, the creator of Downton Abbey, decided to make him have an injury, which is his leg injury. This idea was something suggested by his wife, and the reason behind it was not just to portray him as another ordinary household member of staff, but to have layers to his character. In a later scene, after the funerals of Patrick and James, who unfortunately died in the Titanic, Carson has a conversation with Mrs. Hughes about the funeral and his regrets in life. Mrs. Hughes ponders if she would have liked to take an occupation either in a factory or in retail, which Carson dismisses as he solely devotes his life to the Crawley family, and we see this throughout Carson's character throughout the whole series. In late Edwardian England, it was a rule that all head housekeepers, like Mrs. Hughes, would be unmarried and have no children. So the character of Mrs. Hughes is kind of like an older version of Bridget Jones, but in 1912. I think all these little lines and quotes in the screenplay are little nods to the time period, and the writers of the show have actually thought about what it would have been like to be a person working in a job like this and what it would have been like to have an ordinary life in 1912. After the funeral, in the evening, we are introduced to the matriarch and above all, stealer of the entire show, Lady Violet, played by the legendary Dame Maggie Smith. My personal opinion is that the casting director's first choice for Violet was always going to be Dame Maggie, as she's the creme de la creme of English actors like Dame Judi Dench and Sir Ian McKellen. Dame Maggie Smith is always associated with every TV show associated with England, like Harry Potter, Becoming Jane, The Secret Garden. Basically, any TV show or film that features Dame Maggie Smith is worth watching, and international audiences will adore it. I mean, no wonder we had Downton Abbey fever gripping the world back in the 2010s. Robert and Violet share a humorous interaction, which is what we will expect of Violet many more times in the show, regarding the light bulbs in the drawing room being ghastly. Light installations were uncommon in 1912, were only used in big houses like Downton. The design for the first light bulb back then was only approved by the end of 1911, and it wasn't until 1926 that most households had light bulbs. So this little scene here, again, it shows you that because the Earl of Grantham owns the prosperous estate of Downton Abbey, he can afford the mod cons of 1912, which would be electricity, which is just a normal thing to me and you in our everyday lives. The next day, the estate receives a visitor in the form of the Duke of Crowborough, played by Charlie Cox, who is deemed to be a good suitor for Mary, and he won't be the last one, assure me. I think Cora and Robert might have slightly forgotten that Patrick, Mary's fiance, had literally died a few days prior, and they've drawn in another suitor like the speed of a London Underground train going through rush hour. I mean, poor Mary never had a time to grieve. During the Duke's visit, Mary takes some time, a stroll in the servants' corridors to charm her latest suitor. They both decide to snoop around the rooms, which Mary apologises to Bates for entering Barrow's room, which this gesture shows that Mary does have a kind soul to her rough exterior. In my mind, she's the female version of Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice. You need to know the true version of her to connect with the character. In this scene, there is another little reference to Julian Fellowes, as the Duke recalls to Mary that they went to a conservatory owned by the Northbrooks, who were a family who are very good friends with Julian Fellowes. The visit from the Duke of Crowborough gives us an insight into the life of Thomas Barrow. Like Mary, Thomas Barrow is another character that makes a lot of progression throughout the series whilst dealing with his sexuality. At first, viewers may perceive him to be a villain and a schemer, but they soon discover he has a heart and a kind nature. Barrow is appointed the Duke's valet, and we learn that he has a past with him, which would have been a taboo subject in 1912, as men were condemned for their sexuality, often going to jail, being given hormone injections, or just considered outcasts. So these actions by Barrow make him a more layered character, and over time the audience root for him. Our episode ends showing us the exterior of an all-British, old-style townhouse in Manchester. The occupants are Matthew Crawley, who at this point in the show we really don't know much about his life apart from being the new heir of Downton Abbey until his first appearance. The character of Matthew Crawley would later go on to destroy the Downton Abbey fandom for his death in the Christmas special. We'll get to that later on. But in the scene, Matthew is having breakfast with Isabel, his mother, and he receives a letter from Robert informing him that he's the new heir to the Downton estate. He says to Isabel, Lord Grantham is going to change our lives. And as they say, the rest is history.